The city was a sprawling, indifferent organism, and Leo was a cell clinging to its forgotten edges. His world was a canvas of concrete and steel, a labyrinth of alleyways and underpasses that most people saw only as a means to an end. But to Leo, it was a home. It was a library, a pantry, and a fortress, all in one. His bed was a stack of clean, dry cardboard boxes, tucked into a secluded alcove, beneath a massive concrete pillar, where the perpetual hum of the highway above was a constant low-frequency lullaby. The cold, unyielding reality of his existence had long since stripped away the sentimentalities of childhood, leaving behind a sharp, pragmatic mind. He was not a child of dreams, but a child of data. He was not a victim of his circumstances, but a meticulous student of them. He had learned to read the city's unspoken language, a cryptic code of discarded items and human patterns, with a precision that belied his 12 years. His day began with the first blush of dawn, a soft, ethereal gray that seeped through the grime-streaked gaps in the overpass. The world of the night, a silent, shadowy place he knew intimately, was slowly giving way to the frantic, indifferent energy of the morning. His first task, his daily ritual, was a census of his small personal domain. He checked his meager possessions, a tattered but clean blanket, a few plastic bottles for water, and his most prized possession, a small, cracked magnifying glass he had found discarded on a subway bench. With this lens, a relic of a life he could only imagine, he could see the world in a way others couldn't. He could read the impossibly small print on labels, a skill that had become not just a hobby but a matter of survival. Leo's hunger was a constant gnawing presence, but he had learned to manage it, to treat it as a data point rather than a debilitating force. His foraging was an art form. He knew which dumpsters were safe and which were not, which bins were the most likely to yield a discarded sandwich or a still-sealed juice box. He moved with a quiet, ghost-like efficiency, his small frame a testament to a life of scarcity and constant motion. He knew the rhythms of the city's heart, the times when the restaurants would empty their bins, when the office buildings would fill with people, and when the streets would become a river of indifferent faces. He was a scientist of the streets, and his laboratory was the entire city. His education came from the discarded books he found in the free boxes outside a small public library. He had a particular fascination with science and chemistry. He would spend hours poring over the fine print on the labels of discarded food, his magnifying glass a portal into a world of complex chemical compounds and foreign-sounding preservatives. He would mutter the names to himself, memorizing the effects of certain stabilizers and emulsifiers, a vast and useless-seeming encyclopedia of chemical knowledge in his small, brilliant mind. The other homeless people in his area, a community of misfits who had learned to tolerate each other, saw him as a strange, quiet kid. They called him the Professor, a nickname he wore with a quiet, unbothered dignity. They didn't understand his obsession, his meticulous fascination with the microscopic details of the world, but they respected his quiet competence. One afternoon, the relentless torrent of humanity that flowed through the city streets brought a new kind of challenge. Leo, foraging for bottles and cans in a crowded marketplace, saw a small, frail, elderly woman, her face a confused mask of worry and fear. She was lost, her eyes darting nervously from face to face, her small, trembling hands clutching a shopping bag. The river of people simply flowed around her, indifferent to her quiet distress. They were too busy, too consumed by their own lives and their own destinations, to see the quiet desperation in her eyes. To them, she was a momentary obstacle, a piece of urban debris to be navigated around. But to Leo, she was a data point, an anomaly in the city's brutal equation. He saw her fragility, her fear, her profound sense of being utterly alone. The old woman, her voice, a reedy, trembling whisper, asked a passing couple for directions. But they simply brushed past her, their faces a blank canvas of indifference. She looked down at a piece of paper in her hand, her eyes clouded with tears of frustration. The woman was completely disoriented. For a moment, Leo's pragmatic mind warred with his inherent kindness. Helping her would take time. It would cost him valuable foraging. Time he could be spending gathering resources for the coming night. But as he looked at her frail form, her trembling hands, he felt a pull, a quiet, almost inaudible voice inside him that told him that this was more important than a few discarded bottles. It was a feeling of duty, a whisper of a forgotten humanity that he had not entirely lost. He walked over to her, his movements quiet and non-threatening. "Ma'am," he asked, his voice soft, almost swallowed by the noise of the market. "Are you lost?" The old woman, startled, looked down at him, her eyes wide with a combination of surprise and a faint fear. She saw a boy thin and dressed in clothes that were too big for him, his face streaked with a bit of grime. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Yes, I am. I'm trying to get to the number 5 bus line to take me to the community center. But I can't seem to find the right street." Leo, without a moment's hesitation, took the crumpled piece of paper from her hand. His eyes, quick and efficient, scanned the address. He knew this part of the city intimately. He knew the shortcuts, the back alleys, the hidden paths that the regular people never took. "It's not far," he said, handing the paper back to her. "But you're going the wrong way. The bus stop is on the other side of the marketplace. The streets are a bit confusing here." The old woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a new hesitant hope. Could you show me?" she asked, her voice still trembling. Leo, a boy who had learned to never take anything for granted, took her hand. It was soft and wrinkled, a stark contrast to his own small, calloused fingers. "It's my pleasure," he said with a simple sincerity that took the old woman by surprise. He led her through the labyrinth of the marketplace, his small frame a beacon in the sea of humanity. He navigated the crowded aisles with a practiced grace, a whisper of a promise of safety in a world of urban chaos. He kept her safe from the jostling elbows and the indifferent feet of the crowd, his small hand holding hers with a steady, unwavering grip. He didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't even expect a thank you. He was simply doing what he felt was right, a small act of kindness that was a profound expression of his quiet, unburdened dignity. As they reached the bus stop, the old woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, tearful gratitude. "Thank you, my dear," she said, her voice now steady with emotion. "You're a very kind boy. Here, please." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a few crumpled dollar bills. "Buy yourself something to eat." Leo, with a shake of his head, gently pushed her hand away. "No, ma'am. It's my pleasure. You take care now." He didn't want her money. He didn't want her gratitude. He had simply done what he had to do. The bus arrived, and the old woman, with a final tearful smile, got on board. As the bus pulled away, Leo, with a quiet sense of satisfaction, watched it go. He had lost some valuable time, but he had gained something far more important, the reaffirmation of his own humanity. It was a small, quiet moment in a world of chaos, and it was a moment he would hold close to his heart. Meanwhile, in a different world, a world of glass and steel and soaring ambition, Julian Thorne was a king in his own meticulously constructed kingdom. His penthouse apartment, a minimalist masterpiece of stark lines and cold-polished surfaces, was a fortress against the untidy chaos of the city below. He was a man of logic, a billionaire who had built his empire on data analysis and algorithmic precision. He saw the world not in terms of emotions or feelings, but in terms of efficiency and profitability. He was a man who believed in the inherent superiority of a structured, logical existence, and he had a deep-seated contempt for what he perceived as weakness, sentimentality, and the untidy mess of human emotion. He saw the homeless, the poor, the down and out, not as people in need, but as a statistical anomaly, a failure in the city's brutal equation. To him, they were a problem to be solved, a data point to be eliminated. His day, like his life, was a masterpiece of ruthless efficiency. He woke at the same time every day, ate the same precisely measured breakfast, and spent his days in his corporate office, a sterile, silent sanctuary, where he could pore over data points and algorithms with a cold, focused precision. He had no friends, no family, no emotional attachments. He saw them as a liability, a potential flaw in his otherwise perfect logical world. His only companions were the endless stream of data, the quiet hum of his high-tech gadgets, and the cold, unyielding silence of his own mind. He was a man who had everything, and yet he was utterly and profoundly alone. But on this particular day, a subtle, almost imperceptible deviation from his routine had occurred. A minor glitch in the city's power grid had caused a temporary failure in his private chef's kitchen, a small, insignificant event that was to Julian a frustrating and uncharacteristic display of chaos. He had been forced to leave his penthouse to venture out into the untidy chaos of the city to find something to eat. It was a violation of his meticulously crafted routine, and he was not pleased. He walked the streets with a scowl on his face, his expensive suit a shield against the untidy reality of the city. He looked at the faces in the crowd not with curiosity, but with a cold, detached pity, a profound sense of superiority. His attention was finally caught by a small, unassuming food stall, a brightly colored oasis in the sea of gray. The vendor, a man with a wide, friendly smile and a thick, well-oiled mustache, was selling a type of gourmet street food that Julian had read about in a business journal. It was a new, exotic kind of pastry, a delectable combination of rare truffles and a delicate, flaky crust. It was a testament to the kind of innovative entrepreneurial spirit that Julian admired, a single data point of success in a sea of mediocrity. The food stall was clean, the line was short, and the product was exactly what he had read about. He made a decision, a small, insignificant deviation from his routine, that would in the end change the course of his entire life. He walked up to the stall and without a word, ordered a single pastry. Meanwhile, a few blocks away in the quiet solitude of his alcove under the bridge, Leo was engaged in his own unique brand of observation. He had been drawn to the food stall by a strange, almost imperceptible data point, a small, subtle feeling of something being wrong. He had been watching the vendor for days, his eyes scanning every detail of the operation from the ingredients to the process of preparation. He had a sixth sense for things that were not quite right, a finely tuned radar for the subtle, almost invisible flaws in the world around him. He had watched the vendor, a man who seemed to be a master of his craft, but there was something about the ingredients, a particular brand of oil, a certain type of mushroom that the vendor was using, that had set off an alarm bell in Leo's brilliant, hyper-observant mind. Leo, a boy who had learned to trust his gut more than anything else, felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He was a master of chemistry, a child savant of the molecular world of food, and he had a terrible sinking feeling that the combination of ingredients in that pastry was not just wrong, but deadly. He saw the vendor hand a single pastry to a man in a perfectly tailored suit, a man whose face, though a mask of cold, detached indifference, was instantly recognizable. He was Julian Thorne, the billionaire who had just with a simple, thoughtless purchase put his own life in grave danger. Leo's heart, a small, fragile thing, began to pound, a frantic, terrifying rhythm. He knew that he had to do something. He knew that he had to act. He saw Julian, the man who represented everything he was not, everything he had been denied, raise the pastry to his lips, a small, unassuming act that would have, in a matter of minutes, resulted in a fatal, silent poisoning. Leo, a boy who had learned to live in the shadows, a ghost in the city's brutal equation, felt a profound, almost primal sense of urgency. The quiet, analytical part of his mind, the part that dealt in data and logic, was screaming a warning. The compassionate human part of his heart, the part that had helped the old woman, was now in control. He had to act. He had to speak. He had to shatter the fragile, indifferent peace of the city and do the one thing he had learned to never do, draw attention to himself. He took a deep breath, and with a courage he didn't know he possessed, he prepared to step out of the shadows and into the light. The world, for a brief, suspended moment, held its breath. Julian Thorne, a man whose life was a testament to meticulous control and sterile order, had the exotic truffle pastry halfway to his lips. The city, a constant roaring behemoth of 1,000 overlapping noises, was about to be put on pause. A small, ragged figure, a ghost on the fringes of its vast, indifferent ecosystem, was about to shatter its carefully constructed peace. Then came the scream. It was not a child's playful shout, nor the desperate cry of a beggar. It was a guttural, primal sound born of a deep and visceral terror. It was a shout that cut through the cacophony of the marketplace like a blade, a raw, unadulterated warning that was impossible to ignore. "Don't eat that." Julian Thorne, a man whose mind processed data at 1 billion cycles per second, froze. The pastry, a delicate, flaky work of art, hung motionless in the air a mere inch from his mouth. His hand, a perfectly manicured instrument of immense power and wealth, was still. The shout had done more than just startled him. It had short-circuited his entire logical system. He looked not at the pastry, but at the boy who had screamed. Leo, a small, trembling figure with a face streaked with grime, was the source of the chaos. His eyes, normally a quiet, watchful gray, were now wide with a desperate, urgent terror. He stood frozen, his body a monument to a profound and agonizing internal conflict. Every instinct he had, every lesson the streets had taught him, screamed at him to run, to disappear, to dissolve back into the shadows where he belonged. To a homeless child, drawing attention was an act of profound self-destruction. It was a beacon that invited ridicule, anger, and in the worst cases, violence. But the warning, the terrible, certain knowledge that the food was deadly, was a louder, more powerful force than his fear. The vendor, a man with a thick mustache and a smile that had been wiped clean by the sudden chaos, was the first to react. His face, a canvas of friendly hospitality, just moments before twisted into a mask of furious indignation. "Hey, what's wrong with you, kid? Get out of here!" he snarled, stepping out from behind his cart, his hands on his hips in a classic posture of aggressive defense. The crowd, a river of people that had just been flowing in a steady, indifferent current, now stopped and turned. Their eyes, 1,000 points of judgment, settled on the small, ragged boy. They saw not a hero, but a nuisance. They saw a beggar, a crazy kid looking for a handout, a problem to be shooed away. Julian, his mind still processing the violation of his routine, finally lowered his hand. He looked at the pastry, then at Leo, his face a complex mixture of annoyance and confusion. He had been on the verge of a small, uncharacteristic moment of joy, a brief foray into the untidy world of street food, and it had been rudely, violently interrupted by a street urchin. He saw Leo not as a person, but as a flaw in the system, a rogue variable in his otherwise perfect day. His initial reaction was not one of gratitude, but one of cold, condescending anger. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian demanded, his voice a low, commanding baritone that was used to giving orders, not receiving warnings. He took a single, deliberate step toward Leo, a towering figure of wealth and power, his expensive suit a shield against the chaos of the city. He looked down at the boy with a cold, detached pity, a profound sense of superiority. He saw the grime on his face, the oversized clothes, the unkempt hair, and he made a series of rapid-fire logical deductions. This boy was a nobody. His words were meaningless. His actions were a simple, desperate plea for attention or money. But Leo didn't back down. He stood his ground, his small body trembling, but his eyes, those brilliant, observant eyes, now fixed on the pastry, then on the vendor. The memory, the terrifying, visceral memory that had given him this impossible knowledge, was now a vivid, terrifying replay in his mind. He was 6 years old, living with his mother in a small, cramped apartment on the fringes of the city. His mother, a woman who worked tirelessly to keep a roof over their heads, had been a master of making a little go a long way. But one day she had come home with a bag of cheap, discounted groceries from a new small store that had opened in their neighborhood. Among them was a box of strange, foreign-looking mushrooms, a delicacy she had bought to surprise him. They were a beautiful, exotic purple, and they were supposed to be delicious. She had cooked them with a cheap cut of meat and a few potatoes, a meal that was meant to be a small celebration, a moment of joy in their otherwise difficult lives. But the mushrooms were not what they seemed. They were a cheap, toxic imitation of a real, expensive truffle. The chemicals, a specific combination of toxins that were meant to be inert on their own, had reacted with a certain preservative in the meat. The combination was deadly. Leo, a child with an almost supernatural talent for observation and a deep fascination with the labels on their food, had read the fine print on the boxes. He had memorized the names of the chemicals, the complicated foreign-sounding words that were meant to be a simple piece of information, but were now the key to a terrifying and profound knowledge. He had warned his mother, his small, frightened voice a whisper in the chaos of their kitchen, but she had dismissed him, a child's fanciful imagination. She had eaten the meal, and within hours she had fallen gravely ill. He had watched her helpless as the toxins slowly, mercilessly destroyed her. The doctors, baffled, had been unable to save her. He was an orphan now, a ghost in a city that had long since forgotten his name. His obsession with food labels, with the meticulous chemical details of the world, was not just a hobby. It was a scar. It was a wound that had never healed, a painful and terrifying lesson that he had learned in the most brutal way possible. He had learned in the most profound way that the world was a dangerous place, and that the things people put into their bodies, the things they trusted, could be a silent, invisible poison. Now, as he stood in the heart of the city, a man who represented everything he had been denied was about to make the same fatal mistake. The pastry, that innocent-looking flaky work of art, was not innocent at all. It was a beautiful, dangerous lie. He had seen the vendor, a man with a wide, friendly smile, mix the truffle oil with a specific brand of preservative that Leo knew with a terrible absolute certainty was toxic. The truffle oil, a cheap synthetic imitation of a real truffle, contained a chemical compound that, when combined with the preservative, created a deadly toxin. He had memorized the chemical names, the complicated foreign-sounding words that had once been the key to his mother's death. He had learned the language of poison, and he was now a silent, terrified interpreter. The vendor, a man who saw his livelihood threatened, was now a force of pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped closer to Leo, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "I told you, kid, get lost, you're ruining my business." He raised his hand, a thick, beefy fist that was meant to threaten, to intimidate, to send the small, ragged boy back into the shadows where he belonged. The crowd, a silent, judging jury, was now on his side. They saw the boy not as a hero, but as a criminal. They saw him not as a rescuer, but as a threat. They saw the quiet, silent boy as a source of chaos, a blight on the otherwise peaceful, profitable morning. But Leo, a boy who had learned to live in the shadows, a ghost in the city's brutal equation, felt a profound, almost primal sense of urgency. The quiet, analytical part of his mind, the part that dealt in data and logic, was screaming a warning. The compassionate human part of his heart, the part that had helped the old woman, was now in control. He had to act. He had to speak. He had to shatter the fragile, indifferent peace of the city and do the one thing he had learned to never do: draw attention to himself. He took a deep breath, and with a courage he didn't know he possessed, he prepared to step out of the shadows and into the light. He looked at Julian, a man who represented everything he was not, everything he had been denied, and saw not a billionaire but a person. He saw a person who was about to make a fatal mistake, a person who was about to become a victim of a silent, invisible poison. He saw a man who, like his mother, was about to be destroyed by a lack of knowledge, a lack of awareness, a profound and dangerous lack of attention to the hidden details of the world. He saw a man who, for all his wealth and power, was just as vulnerable as a homeless child. The vendor, his face a contorted mask of fury, moved to physically grab Leo. But Leo, with a quick, silent, almost instinctive movement, dodged his hand. He stepped out from the shadows of a nearby building and into the sunlight, his small frame a beacon of defiance. He looked at Julian, a man who was now a towering, intimidating figure of pure, unadulterated anger, and spoke not with the whimpering, desperate voice of a street kid, but with a clear, steady, confident voice of a scientist, a man who had seen the data and had come to a terrible, profound conclusion. "It's the brand of truffle oil." Leo said, his voice now a steady, unwavering murmur, a small but powerful sound in the sea of chaos. "And the preservative in the dough. They're a chemical combination. The combination is a fatal toxin. You can't see it. You can't smell it. You can't taste it. But it's there. It's in the pastry. It's in your hand. And it will kill you." The words, spoken with a quiet, certain authority that belied his age, had a profound effect. The vendor, his face now a mask of pure, unadulterated horror, froze. The crowd, a silent, judging jury, now looked at Leo not with contempt, but with a profound and disbelieving shock. Julian, a man of logic and data, heard the words, and his mind, which had been locked in a state of cold, condescending anger, began to process the information. He saw the boy, a small, quiet figure who had just, with a simple, terrifying statement, shattered his entire logical world. He saw the tremor in the vendor's hand, the look of pure, unadulterated fear in his eyes. He saw the pastry no longer a delicious, innocent treat, but a silent, deadly weapon. The boy's words, the complicated, foreign-sounding words that he had just spoken, were not the words of a child. They were the words of a scientist, a man who had seen the data and had come to a terrible, profound conclusion. Julian's mind, a quiet, sterile machine of data and logic, was now a churning, chaotic mess of confusion and disbelief. The two worlds, the world of immense wealth and the world of profound poverty, had just collided in a spectacular and profoundly terrifying way. The catalyst had been set in motion. There was no going back. The immediate aftermath of the street-side confrontation was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The vendor, a man now revealed as a pawn in a far more sinister game, had fled, his face a mask of abject terror. The crowd, a river of people, now a swirling eddy of disbelief, gossiped in hushed, excited tones, their indifference replaced by a ravenous curiosity. And Julian Thorne, a man whose worldview had just been shattered and rebuilt in a matter of minutes, was left standing alone. His mind, a churning, chaotic mess of data points and impossible variables. He looked at the pastry in his hand, no longer a simple exotic treat, but a silent, deadly weapon. He looked at the place where the small, ragged boy had stood, a ghost who had appeared and then disappeared, leaving behind him a legacy of scientific truth and profound personal shock. Julian's first instinct, the instinct of a man of logic and data, was to analyze. His mind, a quiet, sterile machine of data and logic, was now a frantic, chaotic mess of confusion and disbelief. He had to understand. He had to find that boy. He had to know the full story. The vendor, a man named Marco, did not run for his life. He ran for his survival. He was a small, insignificant cog in a much larger, more malevolent machine, a massive criminal organization that trafficked in black market food, an enterprise built on a foundation of deception, greed, and ruthless violence. Marco, a man who had thought he was a small-time entrepreneur, had just realized that he had been an accomplice in a murder plot, and that a single insignificant street kid had just exposed his entire criminal enterprise. His terror was not of Julian Thorne, a powerful but predictable man, but of his boss, a shadowy, ruthless figure who was known only as the Butcher. The Butcher. A man whose real name was irrelevant was not a man of data or logic. He was a man of power, a man who understood the language of fear and violence. He had built his empire on the silent, unseen transactions of the city's underbelly, a world of black market deals and forged documents. He had a deep, visceral hatred for the city's elite, the Julian Thornes of the world who lived in their ivory towers, and a deep-seated contempt for the city's poor, the Leos of the world who were a nuisance to his enterprise. When Marco, his face pale with fear, told him about the homeless boy and the billionaire, the Butcher did not laugh. He did not get angry. He simply smiled, a cold, predatory smile that was a harbinger of violence and retribution. A street rat with a big mouth. The Butcher said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. And a billionaire who knows a thing or two about chemistry. This is not a problem. This is an opportunity. He saw an opportunity not just to silence the boy, but to send a message. He would not just kill the boy. He would destroy him. He would make an example of him, a brutal and theatrical warning to anyone who dared to interfere in his business. He would not just silence the boy. He would frame him. He would make him a criminal. He would make him a ghost. His plan, a masterpiece of cynical, ruthless manipulation, was set in motion. He used his connections, a network of corrupt police officers, lawyers, and media contacts that he had cultivated over a lifetime of ruthless ambition. He had a story to tell, a story that the city would be all too willing to believe. A homeless boy, a street rat with a history of petty theft, had attempted to blackmail a city billionaire. He had concocted a story about a poisonous pastry, and when his demands for money were not met, he had caused a public scene. The vendor, an upstanding citizen, had simply tried to protect his business from a fraudulent and dangerous extortionist. The story, a cynical and believable masterpiece of urban mythology, was planted in a local online news outlet. A corrupt police officer, a pawn in the Butcher's game, filed a false police report, a formal accusation of theft and blackmail against an unknown male juvenile. The frame-up was complete. Meanwhile, back in his secluded alcove under the bridge, Leo was completely oblivious to the gathering storm. He was a creature of habit, a ghost who had learned to live in the shadows, and he had just, in a moment of sheer, unadulterated courage, done the one thing he had learned to never do: draw attention to himself. He had saved a life, but in doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. He was a boy who had learned to live in a world of silent dangers, but he had just stumbled into a world of malicious and violent retribution. He was a quiet, unassuming boy, but he was about to become a hero, a victim, and a hunted man. His world, a quiet, monotonous routine of survival, was shattered with a brutal cold efficiency. He was sitting in his alcove, sorting through a pile of discarded food, his magnifying glass in hand, when two police officers, their faces grim and professional, approached him. They were not there to help him. They were not there to talk to him. They were there to arrest him. They had a warrant, a flimsy piece of paper with a false name and a false charge, a piece of cynical manipulation that was to them a simple, routine piece of police work. The accusation was a cruel, cynical twist of fate, an act of profound and malicious injustice that was as old as the city itself. "Leo," one of the officers asked, his voice a gruff, professional monotone. Leo, his heart a frantic, terrified drumbeat in his chest, simply stared at them, his eyes wide with a profound and disbelieving shock. "You're under arrest for grand theft and blackmail." The officer said, his words a cold, professional pronouncement. Leo, a boy who had just, with a single courageous act, saved a man's life, was now a criminal. He was taken away powerless and alone, his quiet life now completely and irrevocably destroyed. Julian, a man who had spent the last 24 hours in a frantic, desperate search for the boy who had saved his life, was now a man on a mission. He had used his immense resources, his vast network of contacts, and his formidable data analysis skills to track down the boy, to understand his story, to find the truth behind his impossible claims. He had found the news article a sensational and cynical piece of yellow journalism that painted the boy as a blackmailer and a thief. He had found the police report a flimsy, poorly written document that was to him a profound and undeniable sign of a frame-up. He knew with a cold, absolute certainty that this was the work of a professional, a man who understood the city's underbelly with a cynical and ruthless precision that was far beyond his own understanding. Julian, a man of logic and data, was now in a world of shadows and manipulation that he could not navigate. He used his lawyers, his private investigators, his immense wealth to try and find the boy, to try and get him released, to try and find the truth behind the frame-up. But the criminal organization, a vast and complex machine of greed and violence, was always one step ahead. They had their own lawyers, their own corrupt police contacts, their own network of lies and manipulation. Julian was a man of logic. They were a force of chaos. He was a man of the light. They were a force of the dark. He was a man of immense power, but in this world his power was useless. This emphasized Leo's solitude. Leo, a boy who had learned to live in the shadows, was now a man on the run. He had been taken to a juvenile detention center, a cold, unforgiving place of concrete walls and metal bars. He was a ghost in a place filled with ghosts. But he was a ghost with a secret, a knowledge that had just in a moment of profound and cynical manipulation been weaponized against him. The criminals, his hunters, had a spy inside the detention center, a paid-off guard who was meant to ensure his silence. They had given him a choice: confess to the crime, take the fall, and maybe they would leave him alone, or face a more brutal, more permanent solution. The clock was ticking. The ultimatum was a grim, terrifying ultimatum, a profound and cynical manipulation of the legal system, a brutal and theatrical warning to anyone who dared to interfere in their business. The gauntlet had been set in motion. The challenge was not a physical fight, but a psychological one, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse where Leo had to use his keen observational skills and knowledge of the city to evade his pursuers. He had to use his knowledge of the city's hidden infrastructure, its vast labyrinthine subway system, to escape. He was not just a boy on the run. He was a boy on a mission. He was a boy who had to use his quiet, unassuming brilliance to survive, to outwit a force of ruthless, malevolent power that was 1,000 times more powerful than he was. His solitude was absolute. Julian, the billionaire who had been trying to help him, was an outsider in this world. He was a man of logic, a man who had no understanding of the language of the streets, the unspoken rules of survival, the terrifying and brutal reality of the city's underbelly. Leo, a boy who had learned to live by his wits, had to rely on his own instincts, his own knowledge of his territory, and his inner resilience to survive. He had to use his quiet, unassuming brilliance to outwit a force of ruthless, malevolent power that was 1,000 times more powerful than he was. The climax of his escape. His final desperate gambit took place in the symbolic arena of the city's subway system. He was a ghost in a place filled with ghosts, a boy on the run in a city that had long since forgotten his name. He had to use his knowledge of the subway's ventilation and power systems, its hidden tunnels and emergency protocols, to evade his pursuers. He was a boy who had learned to live in a world of silent dangers, but he had just stumbled into a world of malicious and violent retribution. He was a quiet, unassuming boy, but he was about to become a hero, a victim, and a hunted man. The clock was ticking. The ultimatum was a grim, terrifying ultimatum, a profound and cynical manipulation of the legal system, a brutal and theatrical warning to anyone who dared to interfere in their business. He was a boy on the run, a boy on a mission, a boy who had to use his quiet, unassuming brilliance to survive, to outwit a force of ruthless, malevolent power that was 1,000 times more powerful than he was. The air in the subway tunnel was a thick, oppressive blanket of darkness and dread. It was a suffocating cocktail of ozone-stale air and the metallic tang of an unseen danger. The only light was a weak, anemic glow from a single flickering emergency bulb in the distance, a pale, anemic star in an otherwise absolute void. The perpetual hum of the city above was a distant, mocking murmur, a reminder of the world he was now entirely cut off from. This was the gauntlet. This was the final, desperate test of his survival. And for Leo, a boy who had learned to live in the shadows, it was the end of the line. He was cornered in a maintenance alcove, a small, forgotten pocket of the subway system that was a masterpiece of urban decay. The walls, streaked with centuries of grime and rust, were a monument to the city's brutal, indifferent heart. The air was heavy with a palpable tension, a profound and terrifying sense of being utterly alone. The only sounds were his own ragged, terrified breathing and the low, menacing rumble of footsteps echoing in the distance. They were coming for him. The butcher and his goons, a force of ruthless, malevolent power that was 1,000 times more powerful than he was. They were not a police force. They were not a legal system. They were a brutal, theatrical force of retribution, and they were here to ensure his silence, his annihilation, his erasure from the city's brutal equation. The footsteps grew louder, closer, more menacing. They were not the footsteps of an average person. They were the heavy, deliberate footfalls of men who were used to violence, men who saw the city's underbelly as their own personal hunting ground. Leo, his small body, a monument to a profound and agonizing terror, shrank back into the shadows, his heart a frantic, terrified drumbeat in his chest. He was not a fighter. He was a survivor. He was a boy who had learned to use his mind, his knowledge, his quiet, unassuming brilliance to evade, to outwit, to escape. But now, there was no escaping. The alcove was a dead end. The subway was a maze he could not navigate without being found. His solitude was absolute. Julian, the man who had been trying to help him, was a ghost in this world. He was a man of logic and data, and this was a world of shadows and violence that he could not understand. The butcher, a towering, menacing figure with a face like a sculpture carved from granite, emerged from the darkness, his silhouette a looming, terrifying shadow in the flickering emergency light. He was followed by his 2 goonsmen with faces like brutal, unthinking automatons. They had found him. The game was over. The gauntlet had been run. And Leo, a boy who had fought so hard to survive, was about to become another footnote in the city's brutal, unforgiving history. "There he is," the butcher said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to echo in the cavernous tunnel. There was no anger in his voice, no rage. There was only a cold, predatory calm, the quiet confidence of a man who was about to kill. "The little street rat with the big mouth. You thought you could mess with my business, kid. You thought you could outsmart me." He let out a low, humorless chuckle, a sound that was more terrifying than a shout. "You made a very big mistake." Leo, his small body trembling with fear, simply stared at him, his mind a frantic, desperate mess of data points and impossible variables. He was a boy who had learned to use his mind, his quiet, unassuming brilliance to survive, but now there was no solution. There was no data point, no logical variable, no chemical equation that could save him from a cold, brutal, and utterly final death. The butcher's words, his taunts, his low, humorless chuckle were a cruel, theatrical mockery of the life he was about to end. "I told you, kid," the butcher said, taking a single, deliberate step toward him, his massive frame a looming, terrifying shadow in the flickering light. "You should have kept your mouth shut. You should have stayed in the shadows where you belong." He motioned to his goons, 2 brutal, unthinking figures who moved with a cold, predatory efficiency. "Get him." This was the breathless moment. This was the moment where everything seemed lost. This was the moment where the hero, a small, terrified boy, was about to be destroyed. The goons, two brutal, unthinking figures, moved with a cold, predatory efficiency, their hands reaching for him, their faces a blank, indifferent canvas of violence. Leo, his small body trembling with fear, had nowhere to run. There was no escape. The game was over. The gauntlet had been run. The city, a brutal, unforgiving organism, was about to devour him. But then something shifted within him. In that split second, as the goons' hands reached for him, Leo's mind, a quiet, sterile machine of data and logic, was no longer a frantic, desperate mess of impossible variables. It was now a quiet, focused engine of brilliant, unyielding purpose. The fear, the terror, the desperation, all of it was pushed aside, replaced by a cold, methodical calculation. He was a boy who had learned to read the city's unspoken language, a cryptic code of discarded items and human patterns with a precision that belied his 12 years. And now he was about to use that language to save his own life. He knew this alcove. He had studied it. He had spent hours in its cold, dark embrace, poring over the faded schematics on its walls, a masterpiece of urban decay that was to him a treasure trove of invaluable information. He knew the location of every emergency switch, every ventilation shaft, every power conduit. He knew the city's secrets. He knew its pulse. And he was about to use that knowledge to save his own life. With a speed born of desperation and a knowledge born of a lifetime of observation, he reached out not with the strength of a man but with the precision of a master surgeon. His small, calloused fingers found a small, almost invisible emergency switch, a relic of a past that had long since been forgotten. He flipped it. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The tunnel, a quiet, dark void of danger and dread, was suddenly plunged into an absolute, deafening chaos. The lights, a flickering, anemic glow just moments before, died with a profound and terrifying finality. The only sound was the deafening, ear-splitting scream of an emergency alarm, a low, guttural wail that was meant to warn of an impending disaster. The ventilation system, a sleeping, silent behemoth just moments before, roared to life, a powerful, deafening gust of wind and dust that sent a storm of debris swirling through the darkness. The goons, blinded by the sudden darkness, disoriented by the deafening alarm, and overwhelmed by the powerful, disorienting gust of wind, stumbled and fell, their predatory grace replaced by a frantic, clumsy panic. This was the turning point. This was the moment where the game was no longer a hunt, but a brilliant theatrical reversal. The hunter had just become the hunted, and Leo, a boy who had learned to live in the shadows, was now the master of the darkness. Julian Thorne, a man who had spent the last hours in a frantic, desperate search for the boy who had saved his life, heard the alarm. He had used his immense resources, his vast network of contacts, and his formidable data analysis skills to track down the boy, to understand his story, to find the truth behind his impossible claims. He had a private investigator on the scene, a man who, with a team of police officers, had been trying to find a way into the subway system. They had been stopped by a locked door, a massive, unyielding barrier of steel and concrete. But now, with the alarm, with the sudden violent plunge into chaos, the door had automatically unlocked. The game was on. The gauntlet had been run. And Julian, a man of logic and data, was about to enter a world of shadows and violence that he could now finally understand. He and the police, a small, determined force of law and order, rushed into the tunnel. The scene that greeted them was a chaotic, spectacular mess of noise, wind, and profound confusion. The goons, disoriented and panicking, were stumbling around in the darkness, their faces a blank, terrified canvas of blind terror. The butcher, a man who was used to giving orders, was now a man who was utterly and completely helpless. He was a man who had been outwitted, outsmarted, and outmaneuvered by a small, insignificant street kid. He was a man who had been a god in his own world, and he had just been humbled in the most spectacular way possible. The police, a force of order and light in a world of darkness and chaos, moved in. They arrested the goons, their hands a blur of motion as they cuffed the panicked, disoriented men. The butcher, a man who had been a god in his own world, was now a man who was utterly and completely helpless. He was a man who had been outwitted, outsmarted, and outmaneuvered by a small, insignificant street kid. He was a man who had been a god in his own world, and he had just been humbled in the most spectacular way possible. And then they found Leo. He was sitting in the alcove, a small, trembling figure, in a world of immense, chaotic violence. He was not a hero. He was a boy who was terrified. He was a boy who had just, with a single courageous act, saved his own life. The police, their faces a mixture of professional cynicism and a profound disbelieving shock, simply stared at him. Julian Thorne, a man who had spent his life in a world of logic and data, now felt a wave of profound, tearful gratitude wash over him. He saw not a street kid, but a genius. He saw not a criminal, but a hero. He saw not a data point, but a person. The media, a pack of ravenous wolves that had been tracking the story of the blackmailing street kid, had now arrived on the scene. Their cameras, their flashbulbs, their microphones were a chaotic, blinding explosion of light and sound. They had come to cover a sensational story of a homeless boy blackmailing a billionaire. But they had just witnessed a story of a hero. They had just witnessed a story of a small, quiet, unassuming boy who had with a single courageous act outsmarted a force of ruthless, malevolent power that was 1,000 times more powerful than he was. They had just witnessed a story of a boy who had become a hero. They had just witnessed a story of a boy who had become a legend. The vindication was complete. The vendor Marco had been found in his frantic, terrified flight. He had confessed everything. The criminal enterprise, a vast and complex machine of greed and violence, was now a house of cards. The butcher, a man who had been a god in his own world, was now a man who was utterly and completely helpless. He was a man who had been outwitted, outsmarted, and outmaneuvered by a small, insignificant street kid. He was a man who had been a god in his own world, and he had just been humbled in the most spectacular way possible. Leo, a boy who had learned to live in the shadows, was now a boy who was stepping into the light. He was no longer a ghost in the city's underbelly. He was a hero. He was a legend. He was a boy who had a name. He was a boy who had a story. He was a boy who had a future. He was a boy who had a new home, a new life, a new beginning. He was a boy who had been saved, and he was a boy who had saved himself. The catharsis was complete. The emotional release was a profound and beautiful thing. The story, a story of a boy who had found his way home, had come to an end. But the legend of a boy who had become a hero, had just begun. The silence of the police station was a profound, almost spiritual calm after the chaotic maelstrom of the subway tunnel. For Leo, a boy who had learned to live in a world of constant low-frequency noise, the quiet was a new and overwhelming sensation. He sat in a small, sterile room wrapped in a warm blanket, a cup of hot chocolate held in his small, trembling hands. He was no longer a ghost in the city's brutal equation. He was a person. He had a name. He had a story. He was a survivor. The exhaustion, a profound and bone-deep fatigue that had been pushed aside by the adrenaline of the escape, now settled over him, a heavy, welcome blanket. He felt safe. He felt for the first time in a very long time like he had finally come home. Meanwhile, in a different part of the police station, in a cold, unforgiving interrogation room, the butcher was a man whose world was collapsing around him with a sickening inevitability. He had been a god in his own world, a ruthless, malevolent figure whose power was absolute and unchallenged. But now, in the sterile, unforgiving light of the interrogation room, he was a man who was utterly and completely helpless. He was a man who had been outwitted, outsmarted, and outmaneuvered by a small, insignificant street kid. His cold, calculating mind, a weapon he had used for a lifetime to build his criminal empire, was now a churning, chaotic mess of impotent rage and profound, unyielding humiliation. The evidence, a mountain of irrefutable, unassailable data, was piling up against him. Marco the vendor, a man who had thought he was a small-time entrepreneur, had in his terror confessed everything. He had laid bare the entire criminal enterprise, a vast and complex network of black market deals, forged documents, and ruthless violence. Julian's team, with its formidable data analysis skills, had corroborated Marco's confession with a torrent of irrefutable evidence. Financial transactions, encrypted messages, and a web of corrupt contacts that stretched across the city's underbelly. The butcher's downfall was not a dramatic, theatrical death. It was a slow, methodical, and brutal dismantling of his entire life's work. His pride, the very foundation of his power, was shattered. He was not just a criminal. He was a fool who had been outsmarted by a child. Julian Thorne, a man who had spent his life in a world of logic and data, was a man who was now a testament to the profound, humbling power of humanity. He sat in the police station, a towering figure of wealth and power, but his face was not a mask of cold, detached indifference. It was a mask of profound, tearful gratitude and a deep, unyielding sense of humility. He had seen the world not in terms of emotions or feelings, but in terms of efficiency and profitability. He had seen the homeless, the poor, the down and out, not as people in need, but as a statistical anomaly, a failure in the city's brutal equation. But now he saw a boy. He saw a hero. He saw a genius. He saw a person who had, with a single courageous act, not just saved his life, but had taught him a profound and brutal lesson about the limitations of his own worldview. Later that evening, in a quiet, secluded room in a hospital where Leo was being checked for minor injuries, the two worlds finally, at long last, collided. Julian, a man who had built his empire on data analysis and algorithmic precision, was a man who was now a student of a street kid. He sat by Leo's bed, his face a canvas of profound and humbled gratitude. He had a new appreciation for the world, for the quiet, unassuming brilliance of a child who had been forged in the brutal crucible of survival. He saw not a criminal, but a hero. He saw not a data point, but a person. "I owe you an apology," Julian said, his voice a low, quiet murmur. It was not an apology of a man who was powerful, but an apology of a man who was humbled. My initial reaction, my initial assumptions, they were wrong. I saw you as a problem. I saw you as a data point. I saw you as a flaw in the system. I was wrong. You are a genius, Leo. You are a hero, and you saved my life. Leo, a boy who had learned to never take anything for granted, simply looked at him, his eyes a quiet, unassuming gray. He did not ask for a reward. He did not ask for a thank you. He had simply done what he had to do. He had simply acted on a profound and unyielding sense of purpose, a sense of duty that was more powerful than his fear. "And you have taught me something, Leo." Julian continued, his voice now a quiet, methodical whisper. "You have taught me that the world is not just a series of data points and logical variables. It is also a world of humanity, of courage, of intuition. It is a world of silent, unseen dangers, and it is a world of quiet, unassuming heroes. You have not just saved my life. You have saved my humanity." Julian's offer was not a simple reward. It was not a simple gift of money. It was a profound and meaningful opportunity, a new purpose that would allow Leo to use his unique knowledge for a greater good. He told Leo about his plan for a new foundation, a massive, well-funded charity, dedicated to providing a future for homeless youth with a focus on education and mentorship. He wanted to use his immense resources, his vast network of contacts, and his formidable data analysis skills to find the children who had been forgotten, the children who had been abandoned, the children who had, like Leo, been forced to become ghosts in the city's brutal equation. He wanted to give them a future. He wanted to give them a home. He wanted to give them a purpose. "And I want you to be a part of it, Leo." Julian said, his voice now a quiet, pleading murmur. "I want you to be a key advisor. I want you to be the face of the foundation. I want you to be a mentor, a teacher, a guide for all the other children who are out there living in the shadows. I want you to use your quiet, unassuming brilliance to save them. I want you to be their hero." Leo, a boy who had learned to live in a world of scarcity and solitude, was now being offered a world of abundance and purpose. He was a boy who had been a ghost, and he was now being offered a chance to become a beacon. He was a boy who had been a survivor, and he was now being offered a chance to become a rescuer. The opportunity was not just a material one. It was a spiritual one. It was a new life, a new beginning, a new purpose that was a testament to his courage and his profound, unyielding sense of humanity. He was a boy who had found his way home, and he was a boy who was now going to help others find their way home. In a quiet moment, as the night settled over the city, the two worlds, the world of immense wealth and the world of profound poverty, sat in a profound, understanding silence. Julian and Leo, two men from two different worlds now connected by a single courageous act, shared a conversation about their journey. Julian marveled at how a chance encounter could have saved his life and taught him a profound lesson about judging others. Leo, a boy who had learned to live in a world of silent dangers, now saw a man who, for all his wealth and power, was just as vulnerable as a homeless child. "I used to think that my knowledge was a curse." Leo said, his voice a low, quiet murmur. "I used to think that it was a reminder of a wound that had never healed. But now I know that it's a gift. It's a reminder that I survived, that I healed." that I came home." Julian, with a quiet, knowing nod, simply looked at him, his eyes a distant, thoughtful blue. "We all have our scars, Leo. Some you can see, some you can't. But they're what make us who we are. They're what make us strong." Leo, a boy who had learned to live in the shadows, was now a boy who was stepping into the light. He was no longer a ghost in the city's underbelly. He was a hero. He was a legend. He was a boy who had a name. He was a boy who had a story. He was a boy who had a future. He was a boy who had a new home, a new life, a new beginning. He was a boy who had been saved, and he was a boy who had saved himself. The emotional release was a profound and beautiful thing. The story, a story of a boy who had found his way home, had come to an end. But the legend of a boy who had become a hero, had just begun. 1 year later, the rhythm of Leo's life was no longer a slow, mournful blues, but a vibrant, hopeful symphony. The clatter of mismatched cutlery and the hiss of the coffee machine had been replaced by the quiet hum of a bustling office, the purposeful chatter of a team united by a common cause. His uniform was no longer a waitress's apron, but a sharp professional suit, a new kind of armor, for a new kind of battle. The corner griddle was now a distant memory, a ghost of a life she had once inhabited, but it was not a memory she was ashamed of. It was the place where her old life had ended, and her new one had begun. Ayanna, now the director of the Veterans Reintegration Program at the National Veterans Foundation, was a beacon of hope for countless men and women who had come home from the battlefield and were struggling to find their way. Her office, once an abstract concept in her quiet life, was a space filled with light and purpose. The walls were adorned not with faded menus, but with photos of the veterans her program had helped: a young Marine who had found a new career as a welder, a female pilot who was now a flight instructor, a soldier who had found his calling as a motivational speaker. These were the trophies of her new life, a testament to her courage and her capacity for compassion. The paying it forward action, once a small anonymous act of kindness, had become the very foundation of her existence. One afternoon, Ayanna sat with a young veteran named Michael, a man whose eyes held the same kind of haunted, distant look that had once defined her own. He had come home from a deployment, his body intact, but his spirit shattered, a man who felt like a ghost in his own life. He had a profound sense of worthlessness, a feeling that his skills forged in the brutal crucible of war had no place in the civilian world. Ayanna, with a quiet, knowing empathy, listened to him, her heart aching with a shared understanding. "I know what it feels like," she said, her voice a soft, unwavering murmur. "To feel like you've lost your purpose. To feel like the world has no use for the person you had to become to survive." She paused, and with a deliberate, unhurried motion, she rolled up the sleeve of her suit jacket. The scar, a thick, jagged seam that ran from her wrist to her elbow, was no longer a source of shame. It was a story, a testament, a tool. "This is a map of a place I once was," she said, her voice filled not with pain but with a profound, unyielding pride. "It's a reminder of a wound that healed a battle I won and a promise I made to myself. Your scars, whether they're on your body or in your heart, they're not a sign of your weakness. They're a sign of your strength. They're a story you're now here to tell." Michael, his eyes wide with a stunned reverence, looked at her, and for the first time Ayanna saw in his eyes not a man who was lost, but a man who was beginning to find his way. Her words, her story, her courage had given him the gift of hope, a fragile but powerful thing. She was not just a program director. She was a rescuer, a guardian angel, a force for good. She was herself again in a way she had never thought possible. The omniscient perspective, a privilege of the narrative, now offered a final glimpse into the fates of the other key players in her story. Sterling, the man who had sought to destroy her, was a shadow of his former self. His business empire, built on a foundation of greed and manipulation, had been torn apart by a relentless legal investigation. He was no longer a man of power or influence, but a footnote in a story of public disgrace. His arrogance, once a weapon he wielded with impunity, was now a source of ridicule. He was a man who had lost everything, a fitting and poetic justice for a man who had tried to take everything from others. Marcus Thorne, the young and arrogant soldier who had been hired to humiliate her, had found his own path to redemption. Humbled by his defeat and inspired by Ayanna's quiet strength, he had become a vocal advocate for the Veterans Foundation. He now served as a mentor in Ayana's program, his youthful arrogance replaced by a profound sense of purpose. He was a Type B character who in his own way had been saved by Ayana's courage, and he was now paying that kindness forward. And Sam, the quiet knowing veteran who had been her one-man army of support, was a constant, steady presence in her life. He was no longer just a friend, he was family. He would often come to her office not for business but for quiet conversation. One afternoon he sat across from her, a content smile on his face, his faded blue eyes filled with a deep paternal pride. "You've come a long way from the diner," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. Ayana smiled, a radiant, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I know," she said quietly. "But I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that diner. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been a waitress. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been forced to stand up for myself, to fight for who I am." She looked at her arm, at the jagged scar, a map of a battlefield, and a reminder of a wound that had healed. It was a reminder of a life she had lost and a life she had gained. "I used to think that my scar was a mark of shame," she said, her voice filled with a profound sense of peace. "I used to think it was a sign of a broken life. But now I know that it's a mark of courage. It's a reminder that I survived, that I healed, that I came home." Ayana's life was now a testament to the power of courage, a life built not on anonymity and fear, but on a profound, unyielding sense of purpose. She had come home not to a place, but to herself. Her journey, which had started in a quiet, anonymous diner, had ended in a place of light and purpose. She had found her way back to who she was: a protector, a rescuer, a hero. And in doing so, she had become a beacon for all those who were still lost in the dark. The ghost of her past was gone, replaced by a radiant, living presence, a woman who had fought her way through a war and had finally at long last come home. The sun, a buttery gold, streamed through the window of her office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent, beautiful symphony of a life renewed. If this story stirred your heart, if it reminds you that courage can alter destinies, and that light always finds a path even in the deepest darkness, please leave a comment. Share this story with those who need inspiration. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss our upcoming stories.